Thank you everyone so much for joining the Engineering 101 panel today. I am so excited to be here moderating this discussion. 101s are one of my favorite topics and also one of my favorite meetings to have in general. So a little sad that I'm not a panelist and I'm moderating the discussion. I might throw in some of my own opinions here and there just to have something to contribute. But I think that this is a really important panel because one-on-ones are such an important type of meeting to have, and they're so hard to get right. And it's so easy to spend the time together, but not make the most of it and really just not end up having great one-on-ones. So I'm really excited to hear about all the insights and tips and tricks that all of you have to share with everyone. And before we dive in, I do have a few little housekeeping items to share. One of the questions I just saw pop up in the chat about the recording. Yes, the recording will be shared with all participants, everyone who's registered for the panel. The link will go out at some point after the panel. And also we have a draw to win 2 free copies of my new book, Remote Engineering Management. And the first draw has gone through, and congrats to Gabby Stefanini, who is an engineering manager at Shopify, for winning that first copy of the book. The second draw is going to happen at the end of the call for anyone who's on the call, and we'll be announcing it live. So make sure you stick around to see if you win a copy of my book. The other part that I want to mention is that there will be a time at the end for live Q&A from the audience. So if there's anything that you want to ask any of the panelists that comes up throughout the call, feel free to use the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom bar there, and that will send us questions so that we're able to answer those at the end. If that doesn't work for whatever reason, we'll be monitoring the chat as well to see any of those pop up. Yeah, so that's it for housekeeping. And I want to start off before diving into all the questions with a round of introductions. And Maggie, would you like to kick us off with that?
Sure, happy to. So my name is Maggie Litton. I'm located in Durham, North Carolina. I'm currently Director of Engineering at HashiCorp, working on the console service mesh product. Prior to that, I worked at all kinds of smaller companies, some of the most recognizable ones probably being Circle CI, and a very large company, IBM, is where I actually started out my career.
Great. Johan, do you want to go next?
Hi, everybody. My name is Johan van Eerden. I'm based here in very sunny, abnormally sunny Seattle, working for a company called Nintex. We are a leader in process intelligence and automation. I'm responsible for the process intelligence engineering team. I've been with Nintex for 17 years through acquisition from a company called K2, very much in a similar space. So I'm looking forward to participate in today's panel.
Great. Jachi?
Sure. My name is Jachi. I'm a staff engineering manager at GitHub, where I lead our database infrastructure team. Prior to this, I have also worked at a mix of small and large places. At smaller places where I've been both a manager and a IC, and I started out my career at Capital One, which is a very large institution.
Great. And Jason?
Hi, I'm Jason. I'm VP Engineering at Vidyard, a company based out of Canada in Kitchener. I myself am located in Ottawa, and I can confirm that in my neighborhood it is cloudy. For those that are conflicted, here in Ottawa, it seems to be mixed weather today. But previous to this in my career, I've been, similar story. I've been in a lot of small startups, bootstrap startups, larger enterprises, scale-ups, mostly in engineering as an IC or a manager. Also some gigs as product manager, and I've also done some P&L management for some business organizations. So yeah, really excited to get into this.
Nice. Yeah, and I am in the sunny part of Ottawa, so I guess I'm pretty lucky that way. And I guess I didn't introduce myself too, but I'm Alexandra Sunderland, Senior Engineering Manager at Fellow, and I've been working as an engineer and manager for the last 10 years or so, and the last 10 years have also been remote as well, so I have kind of a different angle on one-on-ones and things like that too. And I can't wait to dive into the discussion. And the first thing I wanted to ask is just to set the stage a bit for how everyone's first one-on-ones went. So I know that it takes a while to develop the skill of being both on the direct report and the manager side of having a one-on-one, because they're a little bit awkward to get used to. And I think it's hard to understand what their purpose is at first. So I'm wondering if you could all share a story of how your first one-on-ones went and what they were like, because that I think is probably a little bit of an interesting place to start.
I can start. I'm not sure if I have a specific anecdote, but I'll just say certainly when I started off as an engineer, I didn't understand the purpose of them very well. I knew like, okay, here's a chance to meet with my manager. That's great. But I didn't know what to do with them. And sometimes my managers did, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes I just saw them as an interruption of my real work. Or some sort of forced chit chat and social interactions that I had to endure. And as a manager, when I started having them, I'd say I fell into all of the usual anti-patterns around one-on-ones in that I had a tendency to turn them into a status update with my direct reports, or I would let them drive the content too much to the extent that I really wasn't giving them enough feedback or directive information that they needed. I feel like I didn't really think intentionally enough about how to structure them.
Yeah, I can certainly relate to that. If I think back many years ago, when you know, in starting also as the IC in engineering, many of the conversations that I had with my manager was not necessarily recognized as a one-on-one, and a lot of it was more based around a status update. And the ones that kind of were recognized as a one-on-one was that once a quarter or once every half year to have a performance review discussion or something to that effect, right? So I think certainly in the areas that I've been involved in, it evolved actually quite nicely into something that we know today that is a lot more useful for the participants within the one-on-one over the years. But certainly when it started off, to your point, Maggie, very much instructive status update. And some folks still like to do that today. They don't always realize the value that still can be gotten out of a one-on-one. But that would be my experience.
Sorry.
No, I was gonna say I started doing one-on-ones at a place I worked. We had a very flat hierarchy. Everyone reported to the VP of engineering, but each team had tech leads who didn't have people management responsibilities. And I started to, it was the expectation there that tech leads would do one-on-ones with the team members. And I started to do those one-on-ones. And they're very different because you're not the people manager. So you don't need to have those performance conversations. And it's much more open-ended. I think one thing I've had to learn is to embrace the awkward silence. And that silence is not always a bad thing in one-on-ones, and it's an opportunity for someone to think and formulate, you know, what they want to discuss, what they want to ask you, what you might be thinking about asking them, and what they might want to articulate.
That awkward silence is the best. That's when the real discussions come out, because it's the pause that's awkward enough that if you don't say anything, they'll come up with something to say, and it will be very deep and generate a lot of conversation.
Yeah, and I can echo a lot of the same experiences as an IC and as an engineer. And I was thinking about this yesterday. The one-on-ones or the one type of them that I can remember is when I was maybe a company, 10, 15 people, and I was brought on to build out a product idea in a very, very small nascent startup. And you know, I recall the one-on-ones were happening, and the only ones in my early career that actually regularly happened were those ones, but they were just status updates. I was just showing what I built on a weekly or bi-weekly basis to, you know, again, it was flat. It was the CTO who kept most of the product vision in their head. And, you know, that was good. And that was a fun time in my career, but certainly there were a lot of other conversations around that later in terms of like, am I doing okay? Like, I know I'm producing this work, but like, am I doing okay? And how am I doing? So I recall that. The overwhelming sense I have from early manager one-on-ones, especially in situations where I had been promoted out of the development team into a lead role, was a lot of intimidation and imposter syndrome, a lot of fear in terms of, I've just been working on this team. I sort of know how I fit into it as an IC. Now, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to challenge these people that I perceive as older, more senior, or smarter than I am? How do I guide the people that are more junior? And just feeling very overwhelmed about that notion of how I'm supposed to conduct them and what I'm supposed to get out of them. So as a result, you pull back and they just become chit chat, or you fall into these other patterns everyone else has talked about. But yeah, certainly not intentional. And I think that's a common thread here.
I remember feeling that exact same way when I started managing people who were my peers. I was thinking like, oh, who am I to have one-on-ones with them? Like, this is so strange. And on the other side, as a developer, I somehow completely never fell into the status update type one-on-one. But I do remember my first one-on-one ever, that it was scheduled and nobody was telling me what a one-on-one was. And I remember just going into these meetings thinking like, why do I have time with my manager? Like, I don't need their help with anything. What's going on? And some of the lingo, by the way, in the chat, I just saw a question about IC. That stands for individual contributor. So somebody who's not in a management position. So this is all very interesting. And now that I assume we've all been having one-on-ones for a few years, at least at this point, what do you think the purpose of one-on-ones is, and how do you communicate that to people? Like, why do you have them now?
Yeah, I'll start off. So from my point of view, it's really the opportunity to get a better understanding with regards to getting information that you won't get in other forums and other type of operating model meetings, to enable to serve somebody better, to do their job better, right, or to grow their career better. You don't always get that opportunity to get that information. On the opposite side of it, you also get the opportunity to provide information to folks, and that they don't always get insights to. At the level that I operate with, most of the folks that I speak to, in my experience, especially in the last couple of years, enjoy the opportunity to get some information and ask some questions that they don't often do, or might be, not willing to ask those questions in larger forums where those type of informations are available. So it's really to obtain information, to give information, and then also to kind of build connections, right? Because you get the opportunity to listen to somebody and understand what the problem might be, and then connect them with somebody else that you listen on the other side of the coin. And that way you kind of grow the network of understanding connections within what you need to build within your organization. And that to me is a very valuable purpose of one-on-ones in whatever format they come through.
I think, for me, I mean, a lot of things have remained constant over the years in terms of it being a crucial framework for things like feedback, or I'll call them intentional conversations to have that often can't be well communicated in other contexts or more social contexts. I think that's fairly crucial. It's also, from a trust standpoint, it's just a really key ceremony for which we can do things, we can follow up on things, we can build trust through action, and we can follow up on our commitments. And I think that's big as well. And the other thing I was thinking about the other day is that this is all important before, and now in a lot of companies that have moved remote or moved distributed, that, not only are we not together the way we used to be, but all these opportunities for async communication, sitting in the lunch area, or, finding somebody in a common area, or having chats, they don't happen as easily and as organically as they used to. And I think now I'm increasingly seeing a lot of one-on-ones serving as a lot of those, not opportunities for socializing, but it's kind of your only channel, your only conduit for a lot of those conversations that you may have taken for granted before. So I think, they're important. They've always been important, but now, their currency, their importance is growing in our environment now.
Yeah, and I think that's so important with managers, but also I've noticed the increased need for one-on-ones between peers as well. Because I think when we first went remote, me and like someone that I used to talk to every day before we went fully remote, and then about a year went by and we realized like we've talked to each other twice all year. That's not good. We should set up a one-on-one. And now it's like a dedicated spot where like really important conversations happen. So yeah, that, and it goes back to what you're saying about trust too, and how important that is. Maggie, what's your take?
Sure. I would reinforce the idea that in remote environments, especially, communication is hard. So you really need to take advantage of all the possible ways that you can do that. And I find one-on-ones especially helpful to follow up with my reports on whether things that we've been trying to communicate in more of a broadcast or asynchronous written way, how well absorbed are those messages actually? So following up with people on if they really understood, the presentation the other day about our new product strategy and how do they see that affecting their team? Often a one-on-one is going to be more of a safe, low stakes environment to ask dumb questions about that kind of stuff that may not have come up in a large company meeting. And it's just a more interactive way as well to have those conversations about alignment with business strategy or product direction and someone's career goals, which you probably wouldn't have a chance to do in a larger meeting. And I also find them obviously a great place to be setting mutual expectations and giving and getting feedback with my reports. So for example, asking one of the things that I like to ask folks on a regular basis is, what's the most impactful thing that you've done recently, or what do you think I would most appreciate that you've done recently? And I'll answer the same thing. And often our ideas about what's going to be most important to the other person are way off. And that's always really useful to get out on the table.
Yeah, I love all of that, because all of those different conversations are so critical to someone's career, and they aren't going to happen unless you have a recurring chat set up and or dedicated time to go over it. You're not just going to randomly Slack someone one day and be like, hey, want to talk about my career? So that's so important. I don't know, maybe people do that, but probably not very common. And Jachi, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it takes me so long sometimes to build that trust and rapport in one-on-ones. It really takes like several sessions to get to know someone, to get comfortable with them. I definitely feel like there are certain times where, I've had months of one-on-ones and suddenly they feel comfortable enough to share that critical feedback or like have that really crucial conversation about their career. And that just like shifts to everything, and it's like, great, this is the kind of conversation that I want to be having, so that we can strategize and shape your career or shape our project roadmap.
Yeah. So on all of this, I'm curious about the first one-on-ones that you have with your direct reports, because I think they're really important to get right, because they set the tone for how the rest of them are going to go. And I'm curious, like, is there any particular way that you think that first one should be run, in any type of topics you might really want to discuss, or even anything, because sometimes people might join an organization and they've never had one-on-ones before, or they've had them and they're really, really bad, and they're kind of against the idea of having them. So do you think, what do you think should be discussed in those one-on-ones, and how do you get people to buy into the idea that they should be happening?
I can start with that one. The first thing I do is try not to fly past the basics. Things like, what hours do you typically work, for example? So if I haven't gotten that information asynchronously, I try to make sure to cover things like that. Like, did you get your laptop, for example? And then I have a standard set of questions that I like to trade back and forth in all my first one-on-ones with folks. And those really revolve around two key questions, which are, what do you like to get from your manager? With some examples of what have you gotten in the past from managers that was really helpful for you? And what have you gotten from managers in the past that didn't work for you? And then I'll answer those same questions to really start at a bit of a meta level about how we envision that relationship working, and where we might be in sync or where we might have different work styles or tendencies, and to get on the table that might be a difference, and what do we want to do about that. As for getting their buy-in on one-on-ones, I really think the number one way to do that is to make good use of their time. And if people find it useful, they're going to buy in. Even if it's not useful to them, if you can make a strong case about how it's useful to you, even that goes a long way.
Yeah, I agree a lot with that. And I find one of the ways I like to get buy-in is like, if it's useful for me, it's also useful for them, because the more information I have about what they like and what they like doing, that helps me plan projects, but then it makes sure that I get to like give people work that they want and help them find opportunities for their career growth.
Yeah, and I think it's possible to adjust to their preferences as well. Like I am certainly keeping different schedules with different people, depending on how often they like to meet or how long they want those meetings to be. So it doesn't have to be the same with everybody.
That's an interesting point. Jason, how do you do the first one-on-one meetings?
Generally the same vibe, right? It's an exchange of, ideas and context around, what people like to hear, how they like to receive feedback, how they like to be recognized. The basis for this, actually, I've been using last few years is Lara Hogan has a really good resource on first one-on-ones and a lot of these questions, which I've been recommending to a lot of people and trying to follow myself. But it's about that, right? Setting expectations about, how I communicate, how I'm best communicating, and trying to get that understanding from them so that we can get that off on the right foot, we can start communicating well. And again, back to trust, right? This is just, I'm interested in this. This is how it's going to go. We're not going to plow through, and I'm not going to just constantly stick to my own preferences as far as how I like to communicate. This is an exchange of value. We're both going to get something out of this. I'm excited to talk to you. Hopefully, we can build from there. And that's generally how it starts. But it's really, again, most of the first one-on-ones start pretty much exactly the same with that list of questions. And that's one thing I try to get right or close to right every time.
Yeah, I think the fellow team was like very on top of getting resources, and I saw them throw the link to Lara Hogan's post there. It's so good. Like all of her content I'm referring to all of the time, but the first one-on-one, I have the same I do the same thing where I use most of her questions about, because it's things like basic questions that are so important to know later on, like how do you prefer to receive feedback, and what do you do to celebrate? Because if something great happens in someone's life, you want to be able to, contribute and make them happy. And it's just basic questions that are so good to set expectations overall. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Johan, I see you unmuted. Do you have thoughts on first one-on-one too?
Yeah, I mean, everything that Jason and Maggie said is certainly something that I can relate to as well. The one thing that I would like to add to that is it takes a while to get to know people. It takes a while to build trust, and those basic questions needs to help you to kind of direct the one-on-one in such a way that it's tailor-made for that specific person to build that trust, and you need to acknowledge with them that this is the kickoff meeting, but it's going to take us a while to kind of settle into something that works best for this relationship going forward. And it's very important to make sure that you understand how to guide it from basic to value for each different type of personality that you have, because they will all be unique over the course of your conversations with them over the years.
Yeah. And Joshi, I think I remember hearing something this morning about how you set up onboarding processes before as well. And so I feel like that ties in really nicely to one-on-ones.
Yeah, I really like what Maggie said about, just the basic stuff. I think GitHub is a globally distributed company, and people are online all the time, depending on time zone. And something that I realized earlier on is, if you don't set the expectation that like, hey, you set your own hours, you shouldn't be trying to work US specific hours if you're in the EU. You shouldn't be burning yourself out if that doesn't work for you. We're very flexible. If I don't tell people that, they don't know that. So that's something I try to communicate during onboarding. I also try to be very clear that like this is a recurring one-on-one, or like we try to figure out what cadence works best. I know some people prefer less frequently but a longer session, and then other people do prefer like a 30-minute session every week, or more check-ins even throughout the week. But that's up to the individual to figure out as well.
Yeah, and so that leads into the next thing I want to talk about, which is recurring one-on-ones. And I'm definitely a big believer in the fact that one-on-ones should be scheduled recurring so that you know exactly when they're going to happen. It shouldn't be scheduled one at a time. I hope we all agree on that. But I did want to talk a bit about things like the one-on-one agenda. And I guess I'm curious too, like to start off, if you have like set agendas when you go into one-on-ones every week, but then also there's a lot of discussion around who sets the agenda. And I think they're kind of two camps, one which is very much where it's the reports meeting, they should be setting the majority of the agenda and using the time how they want. And then from what I can tell, a smaller group that thinks that it's a little bit more equal and balanced out. So the things I'm curious about then are, so who do you think should be setting the agenda? How does that balance happen? And hopefully you do have agendas. And what do you think the right cadence and topics are for those recurring one-on-ones? Chachi, maybe we can start.
Yeah, I can start first. So it definitely it depends. Sometimes earlier on during onboarding, I tend to be the one setting the agenda. But as time goes on, definitely shift towards more of the reports meeting. In my one-on-ones with my like senior and staff engineers, they set the agenda. They can set that agenda, send it to me beforehand, or they just tell me what the agenda items are the first 5 minutes. It works out. I can definitely say that when I have one-on-ones with my management chain, I definitely bring an agenda because I don't want to make it seem like I'm not prepared. And, that's valuable time. I rarely have one-on-ones with our senior leadership. So that's very valuable time for me. And I want to make sure I'm using it wisely.
Yeah, I would echo that. Typically early on, I might drive more of the agenda, especially depending on the seniority level of the report that I have, because some people don't know what to do with a one-on-one and don't know what questions might be useful for them to be asking me. Then it tends to become more collaborative as time goes on. Like I always want the priority to be on what topics does my report want to talk with me about? But I also like to have regular touch points of things that I want to check in on. Like I usually try to have some gauge of their job satisfaction and engagement. So one of the questions I like to ask folks is, in a word or short phrase, tell me how you're feeling about things the past 2 weeks, for example. And I find that having that kind of flexible agenda, so I like having an agenda, but not one that's very rigid, that helps prevent me from wandering into a status update or a meandering social conversation that may help build trust and relationship, but at the expense of other things that we might want to talk about. So that's how I try to model mine.
I love what you said about having like a word or two about how you're feeling, because that's like a very nice, gentle way of maybe getting into harder topics too. Because if something's going on, people won't necessarily come out of the gate saying like, this thing's happening and I need to talk about it. But if you put sad or something, then that prompts the manager to be like, well, why? And it's easier to talk about it. And an example of that I really liked, fellow team will probably be right on top of this if I get it wrong, but I think the example of this I liked was from Katie Wild's Super Managers episode, maybe, where there was like a Giphy check-in for the whole team, or a GIF or whatever. So you would like post a GIF explaining how you're doing. And that is like a really fun way of getting the like a morale check on the team. And I love that idea.
Yeah, I would also concur with Jackie in terms of it grows over time, right? In the beginning, you tend to bring quite a bit to the agenda, but very quickly it kind of shifts gears towards the other participant bringing some more items to the agenda, and then depending on the personality, most of the cases that I've experienced, it starts to blend into a two-sided agenda that gets built over time. Predominantly coming from the person that you talk to, and it also depends. My manager, for example, loves to set the agenda, and it's all relevant, and it's great because then I don't have to always think about what I can prepare, but I don't always have to think about it up front. I know there's some questions that's going to be asked, so it's really very, very dependent eventually on how that relationship evolves over time, and how that agenda also seems to form, from my experience.
Yeah, I concur with what everyone's saying. I think the key point that I really like in all of this is that there's organization, there's agendas, but it's not so rigid. And I heard this right at the start, and it was an anti-pattern that I fell into as I was starting to embrace one-on-ones and start to practice them. Is it's possible to over organize them to a sense where there's nowhere for the conversation to go, because you can't always predict how it's going to go. Perhaps there's things you have to deliver, but yeah, I think what is orchestrated is at the start in terms of these openers, these open-ended questions, in terms of getting into some of these topics. And what really helped me a long time ago, I think it's a 12-year-old article, but Rands, so Michael Lopp, Rands and Repose, had an article that was Update Vent Disaster. I'm paraphrasing the title, but it was basically saying that you don't know walking in what type of one-on-one you're having, and there are different types of one-on-ones. Sometimes they're fairly routine, you're covering some topics, building on some threads you had before. Sometimes you get completely surprised. And you need to have space in that meeting outside of the agenda to honor where that discussion is going and where that emotional energy and where all that is going. And I think that's the biggest thing is for me, the agenda has some framework on it, some things we want to touch on, but also has to have space to be able to respond to where things are going and what the actual need of the conversation and the relationship is in that moment.
I totally agree. And I think one of the mistakes I made very early on when I became a manager is like, I love everything being super organized, very process oriented. And I went a little too hardcore on that. And my one-on-one template, I structured it so there were like 5 different headings where it's like, let's talk about priorities here and feedback here and this here. And it was just this massive thing, even if nobody had written any notes in it. And my idea was like, oh, this will make these topics top of mind so that people will always add items to each section and we'll always have all this stuff to talk about. And that never ended up happening. And there wasn't even like a space to just talk about what they wanted. And my default agenda now is like three sections. One's just talking points, which is just whatever you want to talk about. And the next, I really like this, is a way of like keeping tabs on what's going on. So it's like, what have you done in the last 2 weeks that I might know about? Because a thing about working remote is I found like people would do really great things that I wouldn't find out about until like shout outs at the town hall, and people weren't bragging to me about the amazing things they were doing that was happening like somewhere where I couldn't see it. So that gave people like an explicit spot to brag about the great things they're doing, because it's important for me to know. So that and then just a section for action items if anything comes up during the call. And I'm curious too. So something that I think people hear a lot about in one-on-ones or talk about a lot is that there's like nothing to talk about, and they struggle to bring, like on either side, to bring agenda items each time. So do you have any tips on how to solve that kind of problem?
For me, it's a combination of a few things I saw fly by in the chat, but there's usually some questions that I have in the back of my head, open-ended ones. And I've heard a few examples already, which I really like, and they're usually consistent to that. And the other one is the notion of getting comfortable with the silence. It's really easy, and I fight that all the time, where it's just, they're thinking, it's silence. We're just waiting for that thought. And if you hold that silence for a little while, usually the result is good. Usually people start talking, usually they reveal something, but it's sort of holding that urge to fill the silence with chit chat and just hold right there. And I think that's the hardest thing.
Yeah, for me, I think it depends a bit on what I think might be causing the silence. With some folks, having some topics or questions for them to think about in advance helps, because sometimes people have a hard time thinking on their feet or under pressure, especially if you're dealing with a situation where perhaps me and my direct report don't share the same first language, for example. It can be helpful for people to get written info to look at in advance, or to ask them questions that are not simple yes, no. So ask open-ended questions about something in advance and let them know I want them to come with some thoughts on this topic. If it's a case where I feel like, I saw in the chat someone had mentioned high performers, like what can I possibly talk to them about? I don't need to give them any advice. And in those cases, I find that first of all, telling them what they're doing well and why it's helpful is incredibly valuable as well. Don't assume that they know that. And also, if I look at any career ladder, it's rare to find someone who is consistently performing at the highest level at every single category. Like, that's just not possible. Even if they're really good at something, are they having the opportunity to demonstrate all of those things all of the time? Probably not. So that can be fodder for conversation as well, or just talking about career development and advancement for that person. Like, what do they want to be doing more or less of? What are their career goals? All of those are ways that I can talk to people who don't need, we'll say, I don't like the word constructive, but let's say who don't need critical feedback.
Yeah, I like that, because so often when you think of giving feedback in one-on-ones, the word feedback itself just sometimes has that constructive connotation to it, but it is so important to tell someone like, you're awesome at this, and here's how I think you could be even better, and help people really grow and not just correct things that are going wrong.
Yeah, one thing that I would like to add to that is maybe recognition, right? A lot of the time you might find an opportunity to give recognition that was not necessarily offered in an agenda item, or the one-on-one, the person on the other side of the line is not necessarily aware of you being familiar with something that they achieved and they didn't offer it. And I found that, you know, a lot of people really sees that as very valuable, and that you've got interest in what they do before you actually talk to them in a one-on-one conversation, especially with skip level one-on-one type of discussions.
Yeah, one interesting thing I've noticed recently is some of my team members have been participating in like a mentorship program, and they felt more comfortable talking to their mentors or their peers. And then they will also like bring some of those topics back into one-on-ones with me. And I thought that was really great to see, like, oh, there are maybe peers do support each other in a way that makes them, you know, frame the narrative up to your manager so that you can bring those conversations to light.
Yeah, and on that, so I also want to talk about because I think there's a lot of content online about how engineers can have one-on-ones with their managers, but there isn't a lot about how anyone in a management type position has one-on-ones with their own managers. And I'm curious, like, is there anything that you do differently about like when you have your one-on-ones now as opposed to when you were engineers, and any particular way you go about having those?
I think it was Dachi who mentioned like making sure that you're prepared and coming with your own agenda to those meetings. I definitely do that more now with my own managers, just because the higher up the people that I report to, the less time I'm likely to have with them, or the more often they're likely to cancel or reschedule things. So I absolutely want to make sure I'm making the best possible use of that time, and that I am getting the information that I need most from them, and that they are seeing me ask questions and be engaged about things. So that's probably one big difference. In some cases, maybe they're less structured, but it really depends a lot on what my manager is like and what they want to get out of those as well.
Yeah, same for sure. I also try to, depending on the situation, it might be a workshop or like problem solving session, and I try to narrow it down to like what is the most important thing I need this time, whether it's, do I need to be asking for additional headcount? Do I need to be trying to promote a team member, or do I need to be advocating for a project, and picking like one of those things? It's like, this is what I want. And that's what I'm hoping to make out of this time.
Yeah, similar. I think preparation is key. I think the other thing is sometimes it's helpful to, at least in advance, signal that you're going to be pulling feedback. How am I doing? How did that go? What was your perception of how that went? Especially if the time slices are fairly small and few and far between rather. But yeah, giving that signal ahead of time too, to say, look, I'm going to be asking about this. I am curious about how this went, how your perception was of this, and what that feedback looks like. And so yeah, +1 to all the other comments in terms of how to use that effectively. But that's the other aspect too, is sometimes when you get those time slices, it's hard to wait for organic feedback to come. You sort of have to pull a little.
Yeah, absolutely agree, and specifically around mentorship and advice, right? Because you come with the possible solution to something, and that's your opportunity to get advice and mentorship in terms of how to solve this problem, or the way you think about it was correct, or there can be some guidance around it, and it's something that could be very helpful, and is very, very helpful for me in my context as well.
Yeah. And I agree with what everyone is saying about like giving people a heads up before the meeting that you're going to be asking about something. I like that goes for feedback, but I find just so many other things. Like I'm especially the type of person that needs to wait and think about something before having a proper answer. And if somebody just asks me something in the middle of a one-on-one, I'm probably not going to be very coherent with what I say. So I need that extra time to think about it before things happen. So I want to jump over to the Q&A from the audience, because we have about 14 minutes left here. And the first question I have is from Rashid, who's asking, how would you react if you tried multiple times and your direct report still doesn't see value from the one-on-ones?
My first reaction would be to ask them, what would they like to get out of the one-on-ones? Like maybe there's something they would find valuable that we're not doing. And to try to find a way to do that allows them the most time and safe space to answer. So again, that might also be something to give them a heads up on asynchronously in writing, rather than popping that on them in the moment. And if their answer is nothing, then I might, as a last resort, fall back on, well, here are the things that I find useful that I'm not sure how to get in any other way. Can we figure out a way for you to get me this information, and for us to have these conversations in a way that impinges as little as possible on their schedules? But honestly, I feel like it's been so rare in my career that I've had people who would consistently literally say, like, I don't need these at all. I get no value out of them whatsoever, that I almost feel like there's probably a larger problem there than just how you're conducting the one-on-ones. And that's probably where you need to be focusing your attention.
Yeah, very true. It's a tricky situation to be in. Any thoughts on that? Because I have some more questions too. All right, the next one, I'm excited about this one because it's a very important topic that we kind of touched on at the start, but how do you build the level of trust required with new employees or new people on your team to allow the necessary difficult topics to be raised and discussed?
I think the first thing comes to mind, and maybe I misinterpreted the question, but I think, with all of this, we talk about building that basis of trust. And I think that has a lot to do with broaching those difficult topics. And I think, and that's a hard thing. I heard this before, right? And I agree, where it takes a long time to build that kind of trust, and even acknowledging that maybe the timing isn't right, or I've been on the scene for 3 weeks. We have to have this conversation right now, just to acknowledge situations where the trust may not be there yet, is important as well. But if there is reluctance to broach, we'll call them crucial conversations in quotes, it's looking at other fundamentals of the relationship. Like, that isn't necessarily just a one-on-one thing. What is it in the relationship, or the sense of safety or the trust, that's causing that reluctance or causing that dynamic? And what's underneath the hood there? Maybe isn't a one-on-one mechanic issue. Maybe it's something else going on there that's, could be cultural, could be in terms of the company's culture and safety and giving feedback, or people's history with that. There's a lot of things that could be going on there.
I think it's also perhaps your opportunity to kind of, build trust from the other direction, right? Because if somebody feels you trust them, they might, feel that they can trust you a little bit more. And I think if you can figure out how to approach in that way with an individual, that'll help for them to open up a little bit more and trust you, because you're showing that you trust in them quite a bit.
Yeah, it's such a hard thing to do. And I feel like building trust is very individual to each person and manager. Two of my favorite things to do to specifically try to build trust, though, is one, like being really on top of giving positive feedback, like constructive positive, but also just like telling people when they're doing a great job, because it shows that you pay attention to them and you care about them and their growth. So that's really critical. But then also what I do, maybe to a bit of a fault, but whenever I do anything wrong, like I'm very upfront about it and clear. And I tell people, like, I screwed up, I'm sorry, like, here's what I did wrong, and here's how I'm going to change it in the future. Either like it's that, or just I promised I'd do something and didn't get around to doing it. Because I think showing that I can be vulnerable with people also helps build that trust, because it shows like I trust you to, like not get upset with me. So we're gonna build this relationship together. There's another question here for everyone, but mentions Maggie. So it says, I always have had 30-minute one-on-ones once per week. And so I also do the same. Maggie had talked about a custom cadence depending on the person. Do you have shortened meeting durations, say 20 minutes for more efficiency? What are your thoughts on more efficient meetings?
I have experimented with the 20-minute thing. It didn't work for me personally. We could never fit everything into 20 minutes. But I think it's a totally valid experiment to try with people. And in some cases, it might work. I would never want to meet less often than every other week with folks that report to me directly. And I have never been able to, I feel, do it justice in less than 30 minutes. But I think that's just my personal experience. I'm not saying it's impossible.
Yeah, I've definitely had, weeks where there isn't quite a lot to talk about and we cut that short. But still, like, there are weeks where there's so much to talk about that we run over. I actually try to not schedule a meeting immediately after a one-on-one, so that in case it does run over, I can do that. Also, in case I want to write down some notes or action items and stew on topics afterwards, I can also do that. So I try to avoid the back-to-back-to-back one-on-one situation that I know some managers have as well.
Yeah, I did that too. I find I've had so many variations of how I schedule one-on-ones. And my first iteration was I want to be as I want it to be as easy for everyone as possible. So I'm going to ask every individual person on my team when they want our one-on-one, and I'm going to put that on my calendar. And so it's just like one-on-ones all over the week. And it was very hard for me to manage. And then I changed and thought, okay, I'm going to make them all be Thursday afternoons, and they're like all 45 minutes and they're all back to back. And then I have 4 hours of like one-on-ones every single week, and then realize like by the time I'm talking to the fourth person, they're getting a totally different version of me than the first one, because I'm just tired from talking so much. So yeah, I don't do that anymore, but yeah, there are a lot of different ways of doing it. And it's going to depend on your team size and seniority of people and how much people want support. So it's, yeah, there's no wrong, there are very few wrong ways of going about scheduling one-on-ones. 20 minutes is quite short, but otherwise it's all good.
Another thing I'll do, especially if I have managers reporting to me, is during really busy times, like the week when everybody's writing their annual reviews, I might cancel one-on-ones during crunch times like that. And I find that most people actually appreciate that, and we can use that time to work on our own reviews.
Yeah. So we have about 5 minutes left, and I want to finish off by just asking everyone if you have any other best practices you want to share, tips and tricks, anything that you didn't get the chance to talk about that you want to share with everyone.
Yeah, one thing I've learned from my manager is that like we want to build an inclusive environment, and sometimes when you're diverse people, having that topic, like here's what I want to talk about today in advance is really reassuring, reduces anxiety. But also like you don't have to, in a virtual world, you don't always have to have your camera on. You can have a one-on-one where, it's camera off, audio only, and that might be a really good change of pace and, be more relaxing or just be different too. So that's something that I've learned recently, and I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, from my perspective, to acknowledge or to understand that it's going to evolve over time, right? If it stays too much the same, you risk of having less engagement. So try and evolve it as much as possible, and keep it interesting. One-on-ones can get a bit of a pattern because it's recurring and it feels the same all the time. But if you mix it up a little bit, it helps a little bit to keep the folks engaged.
One tip that I got, and I think this comes from The Manager's Path, Camille Fournier's book, which has a great chapter on one-on-ones, which is just, I try not to schedule recurring one-on-ones on Mondays or Fridays, because those tend to be holidays. And then you end up in a rescheduling nightmare when you do that. So I found that helpful.
And I think, my thoughts around this are, I think just having high expectations as a manager and a person about how you want the one-on-ones to go, and treat them with the appropriate emphasis and impact, seriousness around it, but also realizing that not every single one is going to be a home run every single time. It's not going to be profoundly impactful every single week. But the main thing is that this is the worst kind of anti-pattern I've seen over the years, is managers pushing meetings or canceling them because there's something else important going on. So to me, the biggest thing that I've tried to focus on is, again, not having that high expectation for perfection in every single one-on-one, and be there, show up every single time, unless there's a massive situation that you can be honest about where you can't make it, and with appropriate apologies, that it's that consistency that's the biggest thing, just to show that people follow and build trust based on your actions rather than your words most often. And this is a really good vehicle to demonstrate that.
I totally agree with everything that all of you said. That's all such good advice. I'll add my one little bit, because as I said, like I'm trying to insert my own opinions here since I'm not a panelist. But one of my favorite things to do is just like ask people a lot of questions, because if there's anything that I learned over the years, it's that you might think what other people are thinking, and that like there's an obvious answer to everything, but people will surprise you, and you could ask the most basic question and they will have a completely different opinion than what you could ever imagine. And it's so important to know those things and get a better sense of what's going on and how people are thinking. So the team has sent me, we have done the draw for the second copy of my book, Remote Engineering Management, and the winner is Mike Adkins who's an engineering manager at Ibota, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. I'm so sorry, but congratulations, Mike Adkins. The team will be reaching out to you. And all right, I guess that concludes the engineering panel. Thank you all so much for joining. I really loved hearing everything that you had to say. This was a great discussion, and yeah, I hope we do it again sometime soon. Great.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.